I still remember the exact moment like a freeze frame in my mind. I was standing at the end of the long mahogany conference table, carefully placing a fresh set of acquisition documents into leather binders. The room smelled of polished wood, expensive coffee, and power. The chief executive officer, Oliver Thorne, the man who ran our multinational firm like his personal empire, leaned back in his chair, flashing that signature smug grin. He looked at me, then at the other board members, and spoke in a voice that was dripping with condescension. "Daniel," he said, like my name was some kind of punchline to a joke nobody else understood. "You are an executive assistant, not a lawyer. Maybe stick to stapling things, huh?" A few of the senior executives in the room chuckled, their eyes darting to Oliver to make sure he saw them sharing in his amusement. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, turning my skin hot and red, but I said nothing. I simply nodded, kept my face completely blank, and set the final leather binder down in front of him. I had been working at Thorne Group for 8 long years. I started as a low-level administrative assistant, but over time, I became something else entirely. I was the unofficial fixer, the quiet one in the corner of the room who remembered every single clause, every critical date, and every strange paragraph buried on page 47 of a 500-page contract. But none of that mattered to Oliver. In his eyes, I was just a piece of office furniture, useful, silent, and entirely invisible. Every morning before the executives arrived, I would take the train into the city, drink a cup of cheap black coffee at my desk, and review the daily schedule. At 54 years old, I was under no illusions about how the corporate world saw me. I was past my prime in their eyes, someone who had missed the boat on climbing the corporate ladder. But what they did not realize was that my age gave me patience and a deep capacity for observation. I watched the power struggles, the corporate greed, and the careless mistakes made by people who were paid 10 times my salary. The meeting today was about the company's biggest acquisition yet, buying out a European logistics firm called Eurotrans, which was valued at $90 million. Everyone around the table was practically vibrating with excitement. The deal was set to close in a week, and Oliver, of course, would take all the credit, cementing his position as the untouchable leader of our firm. The executive suite was decorated with expensive modern art and floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the city. But as I handed Oliver the contract draft for final review, I could not ignore the knot tightening in my chest. "There is something in here you might want legal to double-check," I said quietly, tapping a section near the back of the contract page. Oliver barely glanced at it, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. I said, "Leave it, Daniel." I looked him straight in the eye, refusing to back down this time. "It is a loophole on page 312, subsection D. It is a clause that technically allows a third party to claim the purchase rights under these dormant license clauses." Oliver scoffed loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Daniel, please. I have 3 Ivy League lawyers working on this. If they are not worried, I am not worried, and besides, I do not pay you to think." The room fell silent. Some of the executives smirked, while others looked away, feeling embarrassed by the raw cruelty of his words. I nodded again, keeping my hands steady. "Understood, sir." But inside, something shifted. For 8 years, I had accepted the condescending comments, the subtle digs, and the glass ceiling pressed firmly against my head. I told myself it was the price of staying in the game, the cost of keeping a stable job. But this moment, this was different. This was not just arrogance, it was negligence, and I was not going to let it slide. That night, I stayed late at the office under the pretense of preparing meeting notes for the upcoming board session. The cleaning crew passed by my desk without a second glance. After all, Daniel, the quiet assistant, was always there, always invisible. But I was not preparing notes. I was reading the contract carefully. Every clause, every footnote, and every cross-reference of that acquisition contract was scrutinized under my desk lamp. And what I found chilled me to the bone. The dormant license clause was real, and it was legally binding. It allowed a third party to assume licensing rights if they paid a nominal fee and submitted a claim before the acquisition officially closed. The price required was only $1. It was a clause designed for emergencies, never meant to be triggered, but it had been left in the original papers from 20 years ago and carried over with every ownership change. No one else had noticed it. I stared at the legal print long after midnight. My hands trembled, but not with fear. They trembled with something sharper, stronger. For the first time in my 54 years of life, I realized the real power was not with the people sitting at the boardroom table. It was with the people who understand the fine print. I made a decision that night, a decision that would change everything. I knew I would need a plan, and more importantly, perfect timing, because the clock on the $90 million acquisition was ticking. Oliver Thorne had no idea that by the time they tried to close their deal, I would already be the legal owner of the core software they needed to run the entire business. The next morning, the office hummed with its usual predictable rhythm. Coffee was brewing in the break room, keyboard keys clacked, and meaningless corporate small talk flowed through the hallways like white noise. I sat at my desk outside the executive suite reviewing emails, looking exactly like the quiet assistant who did not make waves and existed only to schedule meetings. But under my blazer, folded neatly inside my leather bag, sat a signed check for $1 and a printed claim form. I had called in a favor from an old college classmate who worked in corporate compliance at another major firm, Claire Jenkins. She was brilliant, analytical, and most importantly, she owed me for helping her through our accounting finals decades ago. When I sent her the contract text, she spent an hour reviewing it before calling me back in disbelief. She confirmed what I had read with absolute certainty. The dormant license clause was indeed binding. It was outdated, but legally airtight. She explained that Oliver's high-priced legal team had likely copied and pasted the template from 20 years ago without actually reading the terms. We laughed about the sheer laziness of corporate lawyers, but the reality was serious. According to international trade law, if someone submitted a formal claim and payment before the merger's finalization, that person could assume the licensing rights of the core logistics software. Without that software license, the acquisition of Eurotrans would collapse completely. I did not need to be an Ivy League lawyer to see it. I just needed to follow the rules exactly as they were written in black and white. At 12:47 in the afternoon during my lunch break, I walked to a nearby notary office located in a quiet brick building 3 blocks away. The walk was filled with the sounds of city traffic and the smell of food vendors, but my mind was focused entirely on the papers in my hand. I signed the form, paid the standard $25 filing fee, and submitted the claim legally and transparently. I paid the $1 in cash, placing a single crisp paper note onto the counter. The notary public, a woman in her 60s named Martha, with sharp eyes and a kind face, glanced at the figure on the document and smirked. "Hope this works out for you, young man," she said. I smiled back at her, feeling a rush of adrenaline. "Me too," I replied. By the time I returned to the office, nothing seemed different. Oliver's other assistants were gossiping about their weekend plans. The chief financial officer was on a call laughing about his golf game. Oliver himself was barking at someone about synergy on the other side of his massive glass wall. I sat down at my desk and typed a brief summary of my filing, sending it to my personal email address for safekeeping. The clock continued to tick. Nothing happened. For 2 days, I started to wonder if I had imagined it all. The silence was fucking deafening. I began to worry that I had misunderstood some legal technicality and that I had risked my job, my career, and maybe even a massive lawsuit for nothing. I had to sit in front of Oliver every day, answering his phone and organizing his meetings, pretending everything was normal while holding a secret that could destroy his career. But on the morning of the 3rd day, I noticed a dramatic shift in the atmosphere. At 9:15 in the morning, the lead acquisition attorney from our legal firm stormed past my desk and into Oliver's office without knocking. They spoke in low, clipped, panicked tones. Oliver's voice rose once, a sharp bark of anger, before dropping down to a whisper again. By noon, the entire corporate legal team was huddled in the executive boardroom, surrounded by empty coffee cups and scattered documents. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Oliver summoned the entire leadership team for an emergency update. I was not invited to the meeting, of course, but I did not need to be. I heard plenty as people whispered in the hallways, snippets of conversations that floated my way. "Some loophole claim," one manager muttered. "Who the hell filed it?" another asked. "The software license is completely frozen, And the deal cannot close without it, a vice president whispered. Eurotrans was the crown jewel of the acquisition, and Oliver's entire reputation was riding on this deal. I kept my head down, pretending to type up my regular reports, showing no emotion whatsoever. That afternoon, Oliver walked past my desk without looking at me. The man who had smirked at me 3 days earlier did not smirk anymore. His face was pale and drawn. I went home that night with my heart pounding. It was a strange mixture of disbelief and absolute calm. The plan was working, but this was far from over. I knew men like Oliver Thorne did not fold quietly. They fought dirty, they bluffed, and they tried to crush anything in their path, and I had just become a very inconvenient obstacle. The next morning, my phone buzzed before I even made it into the office. The caller identification displayed Oliver's name. I stared at the screen for a moment, my thumb hovering over the green answer button, then I picked up the phone. "Daniel," he said, his voice sharp but coated with a thin, artificial layer of corporate politeness. "I need you in my office right now." I smiled slightly, though he could not see it. "Of course, sir," I replied, my voice steady. As I walked through the office toward that glass door, I felt every gaze follow me. I felt ready because Oliver was about to realize that this was one assistant who knew the rules and how to play them. Oliver's office was colder than usual, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the look on his face when I walked in. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the skyline like a general surveying a lost battlefield. The room was decorated with expensive leather chairs, polished awards, and framed articles celebrating his corporate triumphs. I closed the heavy door behind me, letting the lock click into place. "Daniel," he said, finally turning. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Have a seat." I sat down in one of the leather chairs. He remained standing, circling his desk slowly like a predator. He tried to adopt a familiar, almost fatherly tone at first. "Daniel, you have been with us a long time, and I have always valued your loyalty," he said. "I was actually planning to discuss a significant promotion and a salary raise for you at the end of this fiscal year." I said nothing, keeping my hands folded on my lap. His jaw tightened when he realized I was not falling for the bait. Imagine my surprise when I learned that a dormant license claim was filed against the Eurotrans acquisition by my own executive assistant. I met his gaze, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "I followed the process outlined in the original contract, sir. It is a completely legal claim." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Legal or not, you had no right. You had no authority to do this. You blindsided this company and jeopardized a $90 million acquisition." I kept my voice steady, my tone professional. "Actually, I exercised a public clause that your legal team overlooked, and as of now, I hold the licensing rights Eurotrans requires to operate in this market." His eyes darkened, his professional veneer cracking. "What are you playing at, Daniel? What do you want?" I blinked, slowly. "Nothing, sir. I am simply ensuring my rights as per the agreement terms." For a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Then, with a low chuckle, he sat down behind his desk, folding his hands like a poker player about to raise the stakes. "You want money?" he asked. I tilted my head slightly. "Excuse me?" He gave a sharp, knowing smile. "Come on, let's not pretend to be saints here. You saw an opportunity to grab a piece of this deal. Fine, name your price. I will buy you out of this little stunt. Will you take $50,000? Or maybe $100,000? Let us write a check and get this resolved. In fact, I can authorize $250,000 right now to make this go away." I held his gaze, refusing to look away. "I did not file the claim for money, Oliver." His smile faltered, replaced by genuine confusion. "Then what?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on his desk. "I filed it because you dismissed me like I did not exist. You made a choice to ignore my warning and humiliate me in front of the entire board. You have ignored every person who was not sitting at this table with a title you respect. I am not here to negotiate, Oliver. I am here because this is not your game to win by default anymore." For the first time, his confidence wavered, and I saw a flash of real fear in his eyes. "You realize," he said slowly, "that this will not end well for you. The company has resources. We have lawyers who will tie you up in court for years. We will ruin your career and make sure you never work in this industry again. We will drag your name through the mud." I nodded slowly. I realize it will not end well for you either if the acquisition falls through next week. The board will want answers, and they will want them from you. They will want to know why a $90 million deal failed because you refused to listen to a warning. We stared at each other in a silent standoff, the air between us razor sharp. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, realizing his threats were not working. You will regret this, Daniel. I gave him a small, polite smile. I'll take my chances. I stood up and walked to the door. His voice stopped me just as I reached for the handle. You think you are smarter than me? I turned, meeting his gaze head on. No, Oliver, I think I read the fine print. And then I left the office. The hours after our confrontation felt completely surreal. I returned to my desk, acting as if nothing had happened, though my heart was pounding against my ribs. The office was a sea of hushed voices. Word travels fast in corporate halls, especially when an assistant walks into the chief executive officer's office and comes out looking completely unfazed. By late afternoon, the company's legal team was scrambling. I caught fragments of their conversations. They cannot close the deal. The license is frozen. Who is this Daniel? I kept walking, but I was not naive. I knew Oliver would not let this go. The first blow landed at 5:03 in the afternoon when an email popped up in my inbox from the Human Resources Department. The subject line of the message read as a formal inquiry into my conduct, and it stated that an immediate response was required. I opened it, my pulse steady. They were investigating me for unauthorized interference with corporate contractual agreements. A classic move to discredit me before I could build a defense. But I was ready. I forwarded the email to my attorney, Roger Miller. I was not walking into this unarmed. Oliver thought this was still his game, but he did not realize I had already flipped the board. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. The first thing I noticed was my computer screen. A red warning message was displayed across the monitor. Access restricted. Please contact IT. I took a slow, deep breath, refusing to let the panic set in. I knew this was Oliver's first move to isolate me. When I asked the young IT technician about it, he looked incredibly nervous and apologized, explaining he was just following direct orders from the executive suite. At 8:13 in the morning, my desk phone rang. It was Human Resources, summoning me to their conference room on the 4th floor. Two people waited for me inside the sterile room. Sylvia, the director of Human Resources, and a corporate counsel named Mr. Mercer, who looked like he had not slept in days. We have temporarily suspended your system access, Sylvia began, folding her hands neatly on the table, pending an investigation into recent concerns raised by the executive office. I nodded calmly, sitting down across from them. Concerns relating to a lawful, documented license claim that I filed personally outside of company hours and resources, I assumed. A flicker of discomfort crossed Sylvia's face. We are simply following company protocol regarding potential conflicts of interest. I leaned back, pulling a document from my folder. So am I. I handed Mr. Mercer a letter signed by my attorney, Roger Miller. It formally stated that any retaliatory action taken against me, including restricting my access, suspension, or assigning blame without evidence, would be met with an immediate legal response. The corporate counsel's lips pressed into a thin line as he read the document. Is this a threat, Mr. Vance? He asked, trying to sound intimidating. I met his gaze evenly. No, Mr. Mercer. It is a legal fact. If you fire me or suspend me without cause, we will file a public lawsuit for retaliation and wrongful termination. We sat in silence. Finally, Sylvia nodded stiffly. We will review this document with our department. I left the Human Resources office. I had no system access, but I had something much better. I had a clear paper trail of their retaliation. By noon, the whispers in the corridors had grown louder. I caught fragments of conversations. Human Resources is on him. He is finished. I sat at my desk with a locked computer, under the curious and pitying eyes of my colleagues. But I kept my head high, showing no weakness. I knew how this worked. Oliver was trying to push me out before the board or the shareholders got wind of what really happened. If I walked away now, it would confirm their accusations of misconduct. But I was not going to walk away. At 2 in the afternoon, I met with my attorney, Roger Miller, in a quiet cafe 2 blocks from the office. He was a sharp, methodical man, not one for dramatics. Exactly the kind of lawyer you want when facing a massive corporate machine. He slid a folder across the table. "We are filing a preemptive injunction," he said. "If they move to fire you, they will have to explain their actions in a public court. That means public records, which the board of directors will definitely want to avoid." He explained that corporate executives will frequently try to use these intimidation tactics against their administrative staff because they assume that we do not have proper representation. We were about to prove them entirely wrong. The board has a fiduciary duty to shareholders, and they cannot allow a $90 million merger to collapse over Oliver's personal ego. I opened the folder looking over the details of our legal strategy. "Oliver will not risk that," I said quietly, feeling a sense of relief. My attorney smiled. "That is the entire point." The next day, the atmosphere at the office shifted. The tension did not dissolve, it thickened, but it was no longer directed at me. It was directed at Oliver. Word was starting to leak. People were asking questions. How did an assistant file a binding claim? Why did the legal department fail to catch this loophole? Why was human resources scrambling? The chief financial officer avoided eye contact with me, and two vice presidents whispered in the hallway when I passed. And then, late that afternoon, the phone on my desk rang. The caller identification showed the chairman of the board. "Daniel, this is Charles Kingsley. I believe we need to have a private conversation." I sat across from Charles Kingsley in a glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the building. Unlike Oliver, Charles did not posture or try to intimidate me. He listened. For 20 minutes, I laid out the entire timeline. I told him about the ignored warning, the loophole on page 312, Oliver's public dismissal, my legal filing, and the subsequent retaliation from human resources. I presented everything with clean, documented proof, including the printout of the warning email I had sent to Oliver before the meeting. When I finished, Charles sat back in his chair, his hands steepled. "You have put us in a very difficult position," he said. I met his eyes. "No, sir. Oliver did that. I followed the law. The company's leadership chose to ignore the risks." He exhaled slowly, nodding. "You are not wrong, Daniel. We will be in touch." As I stood to leave, I knew Oliver's time was running out. Part 5. By Monday morning, the office felt entirely different. There were no sudden announcements, but you could sense the shift in the air. Oliver's glass office door, normally wide open, was closed with the blinds drawn shut. Charles Kingsley, the chairman, was on site. All morning, executives were called upstairs for private discussions. The legal department moved in and out of the boardroom like silent messengers. At 2:15 in the afternoon, I got the call. "Boardroom now," Charles's assistant said. I stood up, smoothed my blazer, and walked toward the executive suite. When I entered, every board member was seated. Oliver sat at the far end of the table, his face tight, his collar loose, and his arms crossed defensively. Charles gestured for me to sit. The room fell silent. "We have reviewed the documents Mr. Vance provided," Charles began, looking around the table, "along with statements from legal, human resources, and compliance. This acquisition has been jeopardized by a critical oversight. That is undeniable. The question is how we handle the leadership issues that led us here." Charles turned to me. "Mr. Vance, did you use company resources to file this claim?" "No, sir," I replied. "I used my own funds outside of working hours. The clause was part of the original agreement, a public document accessible through corporate filings." Charles nodded, then turned to Oliver. "And you, Oliver, were made aware of this potential issue prior to the claim being filed?" Oliver's jaw tightened. "He was just making noise," he muttered, shifting in his seat. "Yes or no, Oliver?" Charles asked, his voice cold and commanding. Oliver hesitated, then muttered, "Yes." I dismissed it. The next hour was a controlled dismantling of Oliver's career. The boardroom was dead silent except for the low hum of the projector showing the contract clauses. Oliver's face turned red, and he began to sweat, desperately trying to claim that I was a disgruntled employee trying to blackmail the company. But the board members looked at him with growing disgust. They were appalled that he was focusing on a personal attack rather than addressing the massive financial and legal risks his negligence had created. Every step Oliver had taken to protect his ego was now evidence of his breach of duty. The corporate counsel, Mr. Mercer, admitted that my filing was completely valid. The board asked Oliver if he had even consulted the legal team about my warning, and he had to admit he had not. Finally, Charles delivered the verdict. Effective immediately, Oliver Thorne is placed on administrative leave, pending further review. The board will appoint interim leadership. You may collect your personal belongings under supervision, and I must inform you that your system access is revoked as of now. Oliver shot me a look of pure disbelief and hatred. I met his eyes with steady calm. For once, the chief executive officer had nothing to say. A security guard was called to escort him out. As his nameplate was unscrewed from the door later that afternoon, a quiet cheer went up among the administrative staff. It was a symbolic moment. With Oliver gone, the Eurotrans acquisition moved forward with full transparency. Charles Kingsley, acting as interim chief executive officer, insisted on a revised negotiation team, and he asked me to be a part of it as a recognized advisor. During the negotiation meetings, the Eurotrans executives expressed their immense relief that the contract loophole had been addressed, and they praised my diligence in correcting it. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked side by side with the legal team to ensure the deal was airtight. When we finally closed the acquisition, it was clean and successful. One evening, after the final documents were signed, Charles joined me in the conference room. "The board has been talking," he said, offering me a cup of coffee. "We want you to stay on. We are creating a new role for you, Director of Risk and Contract Strategy, reporting directly to the executive board." I was stunned. "Why me?" Charles smiled. "Because you did not just protect this company from a $90 million disaster. You protected it from its own arrogance, and you did it with integrity. You earned this, Daniel." The next morning, I moved into my new office. It was a modest space, but it represented something far greater than a title. It represented a voice. On my first day, I sat at the conference table not to take notes, but to help make the decisions. I drafted new compliance guidelines to ensure no assistance warning would ever be ignored again. As for Oliver, the last I heard, he took a minor consulting job on the West Coast, far away from the headlines. I did not set out to win a war. I just refused to let my voice be silenced. And in the end, that made all the difference.